So let's jump right into a massive question, one made famous by scholars like Bart Ehrman. Did Israel just invent Moses, centuries after he was supposed to have lived? We're going to dive deep into that.
Okay, so here's the claim you'll often hear from Ehrman and others. They argue that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, are basically a patchwork of late, often contradictory sources. And if that's true, it makes Moses and the whole Exodus story more legend than history. In this explainer, we're going to offer a response from a scholarly, conservative perspective, one that really takes the evidence seriously while holding to that historic biblical core. So it really boils down to 2 very different ways of looking at this. On one side, you have the view that the Pentateuch is a late mashup of sources with a very weak historical core and a Moses who's mostly just a literary character. But on the other side, you have the conservative view that it has an essentially Mosaic core rooted in a strong historical tradition about a very real person.
Now, let's be super clear. Conservative scholars aren't arguing that the text isn't a literary masterpiece or that it doesn't use sources. That's not the debate at all. The real question is this: does the evidence actually force us to conclude that the whole story is a late invention? Or is there a better, more compelling explanation for what we see in the text?
So here's our game plan. We're going to break this down by looking at the biggest pillars of the skeptical case and then the conservative response to each. We'll start by examining those source theories, see how shaky they really are. Then we'll look at the alleged contradictions, the huge difference between editing and just making things up, and maybe most importantly, how a scholar's worldview shapes their conclusions. And finally, we'll lay out what a coherent alternative looks like.
You see, a huge part of the skeptical argument really hinges on a specific theory about the Pentateuch sources, plus a handful of alleged contradictions. But what you might not know is that the foundations for these claims are way less solid than a lot of people think. So let's start with that source theory.
Okay, so the classic theory is called the Dokumentenhypothese hypothesis, or JEDP for short. The idea is that the first 5 books are a patchwork, woven together from 4 main sources: the Jahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, and priestly writers. And critically, they all supposedly wrote centuries after the events they describe. You'll often hear this presented as just settled fact.
But is it really settled? I mean, just look at this quote from the scholar Peter Gentry. It points to a massive problem for the theory. There is absolutely no consensus, even among scholars who aren't conservative. Seriously, experts are constantly disagreeing about where one supposed source ends and another one begins. As Gentry points out, the process gets so granular that people end up assigning single half-verses or even conjunctions to different imaginary authors. You end up with this artificial puzzle instead of solid evidence. So the confidence that many people place in this model, it's resting on a foundation that is, frankly, incredibly unstable.
All right, so if the big source theory is on shaky ground, what about all the contradictions that are used to support it? Let's look at one of the most famous examples, one that comes straight out of the plague narrative in Exodus.
You've probably heard this one. Critics point to Exodus chapter 9. In one verse, it says a plague kills all the livestock of the Egyptians. But then, just a few verses later, God is warning the Egyptians to bring their livestock in from the fields to protect them from the next plague. Wait, what livestock? I thought they were all gone. It seems like a slam-dunk contradiction, right? Well, maybe not.
When you look closer, a few things pop out. First, the text actually specifies that the plague struck the livestock that were in the field, which seems to imply that any animals in shelters or barns were spared. Second, we don't know how much time passed between plagues. They could have had time to replenish their herds. But third, and this is absolutely crucial, is the language itself. In ancient Hebrew, the word all very often works as a kind of hyperbole. It means a vast majority or all kinds of, not a literal mathematical 100%. So what looks like a glaring contradiction to our modern ears can actually be understood perfectly well within the rules of ancient Hebrew storytelling.
Okay, fine. But what about the fact that nobody really disputes? The fact that the Pentateuch in its final form was completed long after Moses lived. Doesn't that prove the stories are just later inventions?
This, right here, gets to the absolute heart of the disagreement. The skeptical view often makes a leap. It assumes that late editing automatically equals invention, that someone was just creating these stories out of thin air. But there's another way to look at it. The conservative alternative suggests that late editing can be all about preservation, carefully compiling, shaping, and passing down a historical tradition that already exists. I mean, we know that oral cultures can preserve their core historical memories with stunning accuracy, especially when those stories are the very foundation of a nation's identity. And look, there's actually a good amount of evidence that points to an early historical core. Archaeology in the Nile Delta, for example, has uncovered Semitic settlement patterns that are really consistent with the biblical account. We have Egyptian records that confirm migrations from Canaan into Egypt. And a lot of the legal and cultural details you find inside the Pentateuch actually fit a late Bronze Age context way better than a later one. Now, this stuff doesn't prove every single detail, of course, but it strongly supports the idea that the story is anchored in the time of Moses.
And that brings us to our final and maybe most critical point, one that often flies under the radar: the incredibly powerful role that philosophical assumptions play in any historical investigation.
This slide just illustrates the divide perfectly. If you start with a naturalistic assumption, a worldview where miracles simply don't happen, where seas don't part and God doesn't speak from burning bushes, then you have no choice. You must conclude that the story is a myth. But if you start from a theistic position, where a God who acts in the world is at least possible, then the story can be assessed as potential history. Your starting point basically determines your destination.
And that's the key takeaway here. The skepticism you often hear isn't always a neutral historical conclusion drawn from the evidence. It's often the result of a philosophical choice made before even looking at the evidence. So, after all that, what does a coherent, balanced, conservative view actually look like when you put all these pieces back together?
It's a view that fully recognizes the literary beauty and the deep theology of the text. It's not afraid to allow for sources and later editing, but it holds firmly to a strong historical core rooted in the time of Moses. It insists on reading the text according to its own ancient rules, not our modern ones. And it takes seriously Israel's own testimony about what God did in its history, even when those acts are miraculous.
That key term we used before, essentially Mosaic, this is what it means. It means the books are fundamentally rooted in the real historical events and the actual teachings of Moses, even if they were compiled and polished up by later scribes. It doesn't mean Moses had to have personally written down every single word with a quill pen.
So at the end of the day, in this view, Moses isn't some literary invention. He's a real historical figure, a covenant mediator. And the Exodus isn't just a cool national myth. It's a theologically shaped account of God's actual saving work in the real world in real history. So while the skeptical questions are really important and shouldn't be ignored, the conservative view argues that there are strong historical and literary reasons to trust the core claims of the text. And that kind of leaves us with a final big question. Is the Bible's story about what happened, or is it about why it mattered? Or, for a text like this, is it even possible to have one without the other?